on your pasta, just say no, because you put a dead philosopher on it. Now, for the philosopher himself, born in 515, died in 450, and is of course still dead today. Now, we came up with one thing about Parmenides that's interesting is that he'll take things that seem obviously true and then take them into these sort of bizarre, seemingly insane paradoxes, which is pretty clever. It's like, this is obviously true, but look where this leads. He begins with the following starting point, which seems perfectly reasonable. Whatever exists, exists. If nothing exists, then there's nothing apart from what exists, which seems sensible. If something is, then it exists. And if something doesn't exist, it's not. Seems totally reasonable. So where does he take this? Well, as I said, one thing that he excelled in was starting with things that seemed quite reasonable and heads into madness. So here's his argument. First, anything you can think about or speak about either exists or doesn't. Now, is that true? True. Yeah, because it's actually a tautology. Of anything, it is either this or not that. So it works for everything. Now, if something doesn't exist, then that's nothing. Also true. Now, he claims we can't speak or think about nothing. Although, if the description of Seinfeld is correct, we can have shows about nothing. So this is probably more debatable. But in a way, I mean, we talk about people talking about nothing, but can you really talk about nothing? Like no content? No, because there'd be just nothing. So maybe kind of plausible. So, if something doesn't exist, you can't talk about it or think about it. And here's where things start getting kind of weird. Well, weirder. So anything you can think about or speak about must exist. Now, this premise is based on his view that in order to think about something, there must be an object of thought. And, philosophers still use that term today, the objects of thought. So, there has to be, if you're thinking about something, an object of thought you're thinking about. Something to use an analogy, if you're going to draw something, if you're going to draw, you can't draw nothing. You got to draw something. So if you're thinking about it, you got to be thinking about something. So what is this thing? Well, for Parmenides, the ultimate reality is, of course, what he calls what is the one, like in the Matrix, and kind of terrifyingly it. But not like the Stephen King scary clown, spider, alien thingy, but like the non-terrifying it, hopefully. Unless he was a precursor to Stephen King. Now, what he does next has a lasting influence in philosophy that persists to this day. And he's laying out arguments that later get repurposed by other philosophers, stolen, if you prefer, repainted, all the way through history. We'll see this in our good dead friend Thomas Aquinas, as no one called him, and later on as well. Now, this being, which is the one, the it, well, it's got to exist, because you can think about it. That's another argument. Now, the first argument he gives is what's called, or labeled as, the principle of causality, which goes like this. If being began or was created, it either came from something or it came from nothing. True? Yeah, because either there was something or, those are your only two options. Something or nothing. It's like what do you get in your pocket? Two options. Something or nothing. Premise 2. If being is all there is, which by definition he takes it to be, then it could not have come from something else. Why not? Well, because it's everything. So if being is everything, there is nothing else that it could come from. Now, could you get being from nothing? Well, one of the commonly accepted principles, but also commonly rejected, is the principle that you can't get something from nothing. Later in Latin is no, it's, well, Descartes calls it no ex nihilo creation. You can't get something from nothing. And it's one of the, there's still a big debate in philosophy, also in physics. Could you get the universe from nothing? If the answer is yeah, then that seems kind of crazy, because then stuff could be coming out of nothing all the time, which could be either cool or terrifying, probably both.
They don't see that.
Yeah, we don't think we do. But if something has to come from something, then the question is, what was the something where we got the something now? Now, one solution, and one that is commonly embraced, is that if you can't get something from nothing, and if you're going to get something from something else, then the question comes up, where does that something come from? You got to have something that came from, well, didn't come from anything. It's uncreated. It's always been. And so one way to solve the problem of where you're getting stuff is to say there was never a before. It's uncreated. Yeah, it's always has been. Now, this is later stolen by Aristotle, as we'll see, and then later stolen from Aristotle by Aquinas, in which he replaces being with God. Because one question that people bring up when we talk about God is, if God created everything, stuff's got to be created, who created God? And people asked St. Augustine, what was God doing before he created the world? And he said, creating hell for people who ask questions like that, because Augustine's a pretty clever guy. Yeah, so we see here one of the first, probably the first known example of an argument that later gets repurposed to argue for God, that there must be something that's uncreated. And even, in modern astrophysics, cosmology, people still make this point, where the universe come from, and kind of one of the current theories is it's always been. It didn't come from nothing. There was never like a not. The idea is that there was like a single point, and then everything expanded from that. And basically stolen from Parmenides. Second argument, which is also later stolen, repainted, and resold by many philosophers, is what's called a sufficient reason argument, made famous later on by our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. So if being began, or was created, again, it'd have to come from something or nothing. If being is all there is, it could not come from something else. Being cannot come from nothing, as nothing cannot be a cause. That's the same argument. Must have been, I got lazy with the slide. That was what happened. Copy, the curse of copy-paste. So here's the second argument. Would that be a lesson? Copy-paste is the devil's work. So first, there must be a reason why being appeared at a certain time or another. If being arose from nothingness, there'd be no reason for it to appear at a particular time or another. Thus, being is uncreated. So the idea there is that there must be, some reason for it to appear. And there being a reason, being must be uncreated. Or so we claim. And again, we'll see this with our good dead friend, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Also, the lesson of copy-paste. Yeah, the reason why these slides never got tested, in case you want to know the defect, is last year this time we had the hurricane, so there was no class for a week. So you literally are the first people besides myself gazing upon these slides. Could be anything now. Who knows what's coming up next? No, I always check, in case someone's like put pornography in my slides. Has not happened, but I kind of think that's the kind of thing someone might decide to do. That'd be like terrible. Oh, I shouldn't say. Shouldn't have given people ideas. Yeah. So being for him is one and indivisible. So why think that? Well, his claim is this. If being is a multiplicity or divided, then what would mark these divisions? If what marks the divisions is being, the dividers are the same as the divided. So it would be undivided. So if you had like, to use a metaphor, suppose you had a bathtub full of water. Like, I'm gonna divide up the water in the bathtub. And you pour in like some water, here's division 1, division 2, division 3, done. Would that work? No, because adding more water gives you more water. So he seems to be right about that. If you're dividing up things with the same thing, you're not dividing it up. So you need something, different. Now, given his view, you've got two options, being and nothing. Now, if you put in nothing, going back to the bathtub analogy, suppose like you get the bathtub, like I'm gonna divide up this bathtub, boom, nothing, boom, more nothing. Is it divided? Mm-hmm. Nope, literally nothing there. So either way, going with that metaphor, seems like a pretty reasonable argument. So being is all one thing. So if you pour more water in the bathtub, you just get more water. If you have nothing, you still have just water. So being is undivided. Now, in some ways, this is kind of similar to the Taoist view. The idea being that the Tao is one thing. Now, one thing that Parmenides, especially his the student his discipline Zeno is famous for, is a argument that motion is impossible. Remember, Parmenides' deal was there is no change, and so an excellent question is how can this occur? So here's his claim.
Who stated motion is impossible?
Parmenides, and then later presented by his student Zeno, his famous Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno's kind of a cool name. I know someone had a dog named Zeno, named after a philosopher. It'd be funny to name dogs after famous philosophers. You can yell at them. Zeno's the Plato stuff. Stop chewing up the books. Now, for something to move, you would see me need empty space. So for me to like move over here, there has to be a space that I move into that's not occupied. So stuff that has to be pushed, into emptiness. But empty space, in his view, would be nothing. But there can't be no nothing. There must be no nothing. So there can't be any empty space. So nothing can move because you'd have no empty space to move into. Now this raises an interesting problem, again, which we're still working on today, because on one, it does seem reasonable, because if you have no emptiness, you couldn't have motion, because motion requires that things be compressed and expanded. So if you have truly empty space, it would be it'd be nothingness. It would be nothing. And if you have stuff in there, then it's not empty, and it would seem that nothing can move into it. Now, of course, in physics today, or if you've taken like chemistry and physics and stuff, they do claim there is emptiness, but they also claim that emptiness has got stuff in it, which is kind of a paradox. Yeah. So they're going back to Parmenides' problem, namely, you got to have emptiness for stuff to be able to compress something, because it's got to compress into something. But if it's empty, there's nothing in there. But if it's nothing, then it's not.
See, that's what I'm saying. All this double talk, it makes your head hurt.
Yeah, it's physics.
Because when we look at nothingness, we look at the air, we look at the space, and to us, that's nothingness. But the philosophers say the air is there. So.
It is there. You can actually feel it. You move your hand, you can feel the air because it resists you. So if you do this, you can feel the air there. So yeah, so even though we can't see it, it's there. But the claim is that it's empty space. But again, it's a paradox of emptiness. If it's empty, there's nothing. So how is it something?
That's why I say it's a headache.
It is a headache. That's why physicists probably drink a lot.
And move their mind.
Welcome to physics. Here's your alcohol. Now, interestingly, he also thinks, even though he believes being is uncreated, he also thinks it's finite.
Is what?
It's finite because he claims that he assumes the materialism, materialistic monism, that the being is physical. So putting him in like the categories, he'd be a materialist and a monist. There's one thing, this thing is being, it's material, it's a physical thing. Now, the Greeks toyed with the notion, because the notion of infinity goes way back, and the Greeks were kind of uncomfortable about anything being infinite. Why? Well, something that's infinite would be indefinite and seemingly incomplete, because it would have no ending, no boundary. So, what does he think this is? Well, not surprisingly, he thinks it would be a sphere. It would be distributed evenly and would be this shape. And later philosophers, like the Neoplatonists, believe the notion of the perfect circle, which you've probably heard. There's actually an album by that name, maybe a song. But the idea being a perfect sphere of all being. And so the idea is that the universe, all there is a sphere of being, but it's fine that you could reach the edge. Now again, this raises the question which the Greeks struggle with. We struggle with today, is what is beyond the boundary, and the answer has to be nothing, because if there's more stuff, that's not the end.
I was thinking the other day, we have on the other side of the sun, right?
Oh yeah, we are. Oh, actually, we travel around the sun. So you've been to the other side of the sun too. Oh,
I'm totally. Yeah, we do, because we work around it, but I'm saying.
You've been there, I've been there, we've all been there.
Beyond the sun, what do they say is there?
Like way beyond?
Mm-hmm.
More of the same. They claim is that we have our Milky Way galaxy, and beyond that, there's the other galaxies, like the Andromeda galaxy, and then we have an observable sphere, which is basically the furthest we can see, telescopes and radio, any means of detecting stuff, is limited by the speed of light. So they estimate, one reason why I think the universe is 25 billion years old is because that's the farthest, that's the bubble we can see. So it takes light, to travel a light year takes light a year under normal conditions. And so we don't know what's beyond that range of anything.
So if we can see that far out, we still had not found anything like into our present Earth. I mean, so why would they still think that there is life on other planets?
Oh, because we have seen planets that basically the way they detect them, one of the main ways is when you have a sun and something goes in front of it, it creates a change in its the output of light. Just like if you move your hand across a light, it blocks off some of the light. So if a planet moves in front of a star, it creates a detectable decrease in its light, and we're able to estimate based on how often that happens, the amount the light decreases, what's probably orbiting that sun, and we can estimate its range from the sun, and knowing like how hot the sun is, etc. We can estimate if it's in what they call the Goldilocks zone, a place where you could have liquid water, where there could be life, and they have indirectly detected planets that are in that zone. So there could be planets, could be like Earth.
See, the operative word is could be.
Yeah, because we haven't been there. So.
But we have technology that, how they see that into what do you call them? They got the satellites.
Mm-hmm.
They have where it's can beam down to a certain city, certain block, and you can see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have the technology of being light years away, thousands of light years. So the planets that's between here and there, we can't see what's going on in those worlds like they can here.
That's
If
too
you
far.
can see further than that, in my mind. If I can see beyond you, I can at least see you. So if I can see a planet that's beyond you, I should be able to say what's going on you.
Well, it's a problem with resolution. So for example, if I'm looking at a person down, like people walking across there, I can see them, but I really can't make out their faces because they're so far away. Now, you're right, if we had a camera system that could capture all the photons coming towards us, we would be able to reconstruct pictures of that degree. But the problem is that when it's so far away, we would need, think of like a telephoto lens. You could have a lens, like a telescope, and see someone's face this far away. But of course, it's got to be a bigger camera. And so to have a camera to do that, we would need something probably maybe bigger than the Earth. So in theory, we could do what you're talking about, but in practice, we don't have big enough equipment to do that.
You trying to tell me we have a telescope that can see 3 galaxies away from here.
Oh, I can see the little dot. Yeah,
But that's 3 galaxies.
yeah, you can see the blur. But it's a problem of resolution.
Yeah, but I'm saying, but we don't have the technology to build a camera that can capture these things.
Oh, to see like
Yes.
details of it, but not yet. I mean, in theory, we would. We just have to build it big enough. And I'm not sure of the math for it, but it may have to be like as big as the Earth. So you would have the resources. Or maybe they do. Maybe they know the government knows all kinds of stuff. Now, so then what about this lack of motion? Well, again, Parmenides claims that there's no nothing, so things can't move into it. So, obviously,
They cannot move into it?
yeah, nothing can move, according to him. But, of course, our senses tell us what? Well, stuff seems to be moving.
Moving.
So reason tells us that nothing can change, nothing can move. The senses tell us that stuff is moving. So Parmenides says, he picks reason. He says, it seems like stuff is moving, but it's not. Now, to defend this, along comes his student.
There's a defense for that.
Of course. Along comes the famous Zeno of Elea. Born in Elea, of course, born in 490, died in 430, still super dead today. Now, he lays out these arguments, the famous Zeno's paradoxes, where he lays out these philosophical problems that will certainly, really annoy you, because they present things that, they start with very plausible beginnings, and then they get to an end, you're like, you'll say that seems insane. First argument is this. Zeno's got lots of arguments. He was a follower of Parmenides, and he decided to go and basically argue for Parmenides' claims, basically back them up with lots and lots of arguments. So, first argument against the senses is this. If you drop a small seed, he claims you won't hear it. If you drop a seed that's small enough, you're not going to hear the seed fall. But, as he points out, if you dump like a whole bushel of these seeds, there'll be a noise. So either the seeds make a noise or they don't. If they don't make a sound, then our senses deceive us about they're making a sound. If they do make a sound, then the senses deceive us about the single seed falling. Either way, our senses deceive us. Now, this is a seemingly logical argument, because it's got premises, conclusions, seems to make sense. Now, the mistake that seems to be made here is what's called the fallacy of composition, which is to assume what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. So it may be true that a single seed won't make a noise that we can hear, but a whole bunch of them could. It'd be like someone saying a single drop won't fill a bathtub, therefore, a million drops can't fill a bathtub, which would be not true. So clever, but no. Now, if it were true that a single seed dropping, another objection against it is, well, it's not that the seed makes no noise, it's that you just typically can't hear. Yeah, if you had a microphone, and dropped a millet seed, it would detect the sound. So it's just that a single seed is really quiet and a whole bunch is louder. But, clever argument.
I think it's just we want to get himself taught.
Another one of his arguments as to why there must be just one and not many. Suppose you could have many objects. Now, everything must have a particular size, which is true. If you get a thing, it's got to have a size. And if you have an object, you can divide the object into multiple parts, which is true. And this is basically the problem of infinite divisibility. So if you take an object, suppose you have an object that's 1 foot long. We have a 12-inch sub. Now, what can you do with the sub? You can, cut it. Now you've got 2 6-inch subs. Now you can take that 6-inch sub and cut it, and you can keep on cutting that sub. Now, if an object is made of an infinite number of parts, each with some size, then logically the argument has to be infinite, because it would have an infinite number of distance, which would make every object infinite in size. This is absurd, so there can only be one object, because otherwise, if there were many objects, every object would be infinite. So there's but one, the one. Now, there's of course a way around this, namely this. That there has to be, to break this argument, you have to have something that can't be further divided. Because one of the questions we saw is, imagine you had a sword that could cut anything, metaphorically speaking. Anything that can be cut, the sword can cut it. Is there something, metaphorically speaking, that is uncuttable, that just would be unbreakable, that it has no parts? Now, the appeal of this argument is that if something has any, as he says, any link to it, it would seem you could cut it, because it's got to have some distance. And if the distance is more than 0, then it would have to be cuttable, because there would be half of that distance. And so it seems it would be impossible to reach something other than 0 that would be uncuttable, because 0 cut in half is still 0. You can't cut 0. But anything that's more than 0 would be sliceable. So that creates a bit of a problem. Now, if you do have something that is unsliceable, unbreakable, then you could have, there's the smallest piece, and an object would be cuttable to that point, and you would have a finite number of stuff that makes it up, and it would be that big. Now, this later led some thinkers like Leibniz to say that the points that make up reality can't be physical points, because you run into these weird problems. He thinks they're all mathematical points, because they're at 0. They have no, so you can't cut them. Now here's the famous paradox of motion, sometimes called paradox. One version of it involves Achilles and a tortoise, kind of like the old rabbit and tortoise, but a bit different. So here's probably the most famous paradox presented by Zeno. So you get someone who's trying to go from point A to the goal. So like I'm trying to walk from here to the table. Now, to get from here to the table, I have to cross half the distance, which is true. But of course, to get to the halfway point, I have to cover halfway of the halfway point, accordingly. But of course, to get to the halfway point of the halfway point, I have to get to the halfway of the halfway of the halfway point, and so on to infinity. Now, if this is infinitely divisible distance, then I have to cover an infinite distance to get anyway, because I have to cover every single point between here and there, and there's an infinite number of points if it's infinitely divisible. But of course, can I cover an infinite distance? No, I cannot. Therefore, motion is impossible. Now again, this goes down to, how far can you slice stuff? So if distance is infinitely divisible, then yeah, he would be in a way wrong.
So how did he justify moving his hand from one place to the other?
Said it's an illusion. It doesn't really happen.
Yeah, he was crazy.
Well, yeah. But the argument, I mean, some people take this as, at least the skepticism. You can have these seem perfectly, logical arguments. I mean, if all these points are true, the conclusion seems to follow. But it seems, like I said, it seems crazy. And so some skeptics say, well, this shows, you can't trust reason because it can lead you to all kinds of crazy stuff. So don't believe reason. So why was this school important? Well, many reasons. One is, of course, it gave us the crazy stuff, but it really brought forth this logical method of doing philosophy. Although, as you point out, they said, hey, let's see what the craziest place logic can take us. And Zeno was like, hold my beer, essentially at that point. Also, it led to the development of a debate between what reason tells us and what the senses tell us. Now, we naturally are inclined to trust our senses, but for centuries, science has been telling us our senses are wrong about stuff. Like we think the table is solid, but if physics is right, most of the table is empty space. We intuitively think there's, if you ask a 4-year-old where is color, they point out in the world, but then of course science tells us that color is in our mind. Same with like taste. Taste is not out in the world, taste is in our mind. We literally taste with our brain. True. That's why foods taste differently to people. Because if taste was out there in the world, everything would taste the same to everybody. Which is why, my theory that everyone has some crazy food combination they like, and they don't know it's crazy until someone catches them. Like Cynthia Nixon, she's running for mayor or governor of New York, and she ordered a cinnamon bagel with like fish or something on it, and people just thought, yeah, that was crazy. And that's been tearing up the interwebs. But I think, she just, when I saw that, I was like, yes, that's her crazy thing. It tastes great to her, but everyone else thinks it's insane. And everyone has their own crazy thing. It just hasn't been exposed on Twitter yet. Look at the crazy thing this person's eating. And we all have that. We know what hers is, but we don't know what ours is yet. Or maybe you do. Maybe you're like, in the secret thing, it's like, not telling anybody this because it's so delicious, and they think I was crazy. Also, of course, their use of logic and mathematics. So in these problems, these problems of infinity, people are still working on it, because part of the problem is, of course, the infinity stuff, but yeah, they're right. If you can cut reality infinitely, that's a problem. If you can't, then that's a problem. They also began the method of considering the logical implications of concepts. Where does the concept of nothing, where does it actually lead? Also, the idea that you follow the logic to the end, even if it seems crazy. Yeah, because there's sometimes, what is, if you look at the scientific conception of the world, it actually seems insane. Because we don't experience that because of our senses, but what science tells us is real seems crazy.
But to me, when you get to a point that your quote-unquote logic makes no sense, it's no longer logical.
It's so logical.
Why
crazy logic.
Why follow it? And to me, that's what philosophers do. They ask a question which makes no sense, like you just said, motion is impossible. and I'm quite sure whoever thought of the thought was saying, motion is not impossible, and he was moving his hand, so.
Or maybe we just,
When you get to a point of craziness, you got to be willing to say, okay, let it go.
well, there's also, that's how we discover stuff. You know, we start with seemingly crazy ideas, and they lead us places, sometimes to crazy truths. And also in some cases to very practical things. For example, people look at, you know, like quantum physics and say this crazy stuff about like Schrodinger's cat and indeterminacy, but it gives us very useful things like GPS that rest on quantum physics. And so sometimes the stuff that seems insane, like you know, the idea that the cat can be alive and dead, you know, at the same time, seems crazy. Or the idea that there's, you know, you can't know the location and velocity of something seems crazy. And then we go and we do something like GPS, or we do something like quantum encryption or quantum computing. Like, yeah, this is totally insane, but look at your new computer. And you're like, okay, it's crazy, but it's pretty cool. Yeah, so sometimes it does just lead us to craziness. In other cases, it leads to some crazy, fun, cool stuff.
But then it hadn't reached that point yet. As long as it's progressive and productive, I can understand.
Yeah, so I mean,
But if it's gotten to the point where it's not useful, you remember the last class you were saying, what's the need of knowing something if it's not, they can't do nothing with it? And some of these things that they're saying, it makes no sense. It has, well, to me, it has no logic, just like what you're just saying. It has passed the point of being logical. Now it's at the point of being stupid. And I think a lot of times, when I listen to stuff, I'm like, but can't you see what you said don't make sense? But they try to, they make it keep sounding sweet and good, so you can think, oh, that does make sense. But in actuality, it make no sense at all.
If I could just speak on that. What you're looking at is that some of these theories and concepts come with like, you gotta deliver, like Occam's razor, you gotta deliver it at like its base form. So you gotta take the easiest like example to bring it together. But ultimately what you're looking at is a convoluted concept that has a whole lot of parts. So like, let's take like the fact that like, turning on the light is unrealistic and nonsensical in a time where there's nothing but rocks and stuff like that. Somebody had to then think about the physics related to that. They think about the magnetism related to that, where that electricity is going to come from. If you don't know the color blue, you can't even imagine what the color blue is going to be like. So you got to kind of go to, all right, well, what is color? Where do we find color? If I take the grass, like the leaves, I take the, what is it called that makes the color in the leaves, the chlorophyll or whatever. If I can find a way to manipulate that, then maybe I can take this green essence, use this green essence, and use it and apply it on something else. That thought experiment process has to be done a multiplicity of times, even to get to the idea that I'm gonna take this chlorophyll from this leaf and apply it to something else. So it sounds nonsensical when we're all sitting here and it's just words on a screen. But if you take the same process and you apply it to multiple different things, you can see how it makes clear sense.
Again, that's why I said if it's productive, if it's still in a
Who's
meaningful mode.
productive or not? This world needs to be figured out so that the whole thing can be understood.
If you see you moving your hand and then you tell yourself, my hand is not moving, that's unproductive.
So if you know that there's that vision works on a series of like reflections and stuff like that, and so that everything you're for sure looking at has to be a mental experience and not a outward perceptive experiment, then you have to find a way to make that make sense to everyone else and not just say, I moved my hand and I saw a reaction. You have to say, well, I know that there's reflections and shadows going on. Somehow I know there was an external like reaction that happened from me internally feeling that like my arm moved from one spot to another. What does that look like? How do I explain that?
Even in your statement, you killed your thought because you said to reflect something has to move.
Your eyes work on reflections and shadows.
So something had to move for them to be a reflection.
I don't think you understand the concept of reflection and shadows lie. And that's the problem with why you're.
The light is cast off of something to make a reflection, right? So in itself, something had to move. The light or something else had to move to cast the reflection. So that's why I'm saying something is, movement is being taken place.
For sure. However, that concept that he said still stands within what you're saying.
Oh, good discussion. No, I mean, that's what philosophy and stuff is about. No one disagreeing about stuff. In addition to the stuff so far, they also help with, bringing forth these, what seemingly crazy arguments. But one thing that later philosophers like Plato and so forth had to do was respond to them. Because if someone says there is no motion and they give a good argument, you have to be able to say, here's why the argument is wrong and why things do move as we think they move. And so even a seemingly insane argument, well presented, can cause people to have to answer these problems and prove stuff. Also, one thing that arose later on is the trouble of language, namely, things like this. The term is. That can mean a claim of existence, something existing, a claim of identity, that it is equal. It can also be a claim of predication, having qualities. So if you say something like, something is, are you claiming that if you say that something is like blue, that could, means a case of predication. And then you get into these weird debates about, when people say things like the nothing must be, because you can talk about the nothing and you can't talk about things that don't exist, therefore there must be, nothing must be real. There's problems like something you point out that seems that our language makes things kind of crazy, because we can use our language. It's like if you ever read Alice in Wonderland. Like there's a part, I haven't got the dialogue memorized, but it's basically like there's like a messenger going and says something like, no one is faster than me. And the king says something like, well, I want nobody as a messenger because no one is faster than my current messenger, so no one must be the fastest messenger. And of course that's, crazy, but it's, in a way logical, because when we use the term no one is faster, do we mean that they're the fastest? Or do we mean that there's no one that is faster? Or if we say nothing is faster or nothing is better, someone would say, well, bring me this nothing because it's the best.
So you using something like no one or nothing in two different type of meanings?
Yeah, because our language on one hand, by nothing we mean nothing, but we also mean nothing. So when we say nothing is faster,
think of it as nothing as like something that's actually like in existence, whatever we're calling it.
Yeah, because our normal.
Like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, because our common.
And non-existent.
Yeah, our common sense view is if we say that nothing is faster than, we're saying Bolt, the 100, where we mean he is the fastest. But when we say that, Bill is faster than Bolt, then we mean that he's faster. So if we say nothing is faster, that can mean there is no thing that is faster, but it can mean that it is faster. So the gist of it is that language ends up with kind of weird paradoxes. And then later on, people ran into a problem, like a brick wall. So next time, we'll move on to more pluralist and more craziness. So have a good rest of the day, and enjoy the craziness.